I think that it's important to understand the facility that the Fed created. So what the Fed did this weekend is essentially create a buyer of last resort again. If you look at all of the assets that are underwater because of all the rate hikes that Sachs talked about, and you add up all those losses, that is about $2 trillion. And the Fed didn't announce that there was a beginning and an end to this program other than saying these would be one-year loans. And so I think the exposure for the American banking system at a minimum is going to be this $2 trillion.
Hey guys, welcome back to Library of Wealth. Today we have Chamath on the All In podcast discussing some of the most pressing issues facing the banking industry today. Chamath shares his take on the Federal Reserve's latest move to create a buyer of last resort facility, which allows banks to exchange their underwater assets for a loan that is valued at $1 with added interest. Chamath also raises some concerns about the $2 trillion worth of exposure that the American banking system faces due to losses from rate hikes. He questions whether the top 4 banks can cover that amount and how they will be able to repay the loan in just 1 year without significant interest rate cuts. Let's get right to the latest interview with Chamath as he discusses what effect this is having on the market and what we can expect in the coming days. If you enjoy the content we do here, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's get right into the video.
If you're a banker right now running one of these banks that has not gone under, is to immediately go to the Fed, put all of those assets to them, get a loan, and now take that and buy different assets, different bonds, different US treasuries that are yielding much more than what your old treasuries were yielding. And I think that's the arbitrage that we've unfortunately created. And the other question now, though, however, is what does that mean for the top 4 banks, right? Because if it's $2 trillion for everybody else but the top 4, what's the gap for the top 4? That looks like it's somewhere between $1 trillion and $2 trillion. So that's another amount of money we're going to have to, or the Fed will have to backstop. And then, as Friedberg said, these checks always come due. What do we do in a year? Because in a year, the problem is the only way to make the banks in a position to repay this much money in 1 year is to cut interest rates so massively that these assets massively inflate, and now all of a sudden you're in a position to cover this. So
and
it's
describe what that delta is, because it's about, they're down 15%, 10% in book value, these longer term treasuries.
It depends on the security. Again, it depends on what they bought. We don't really know enough detail, so I don't want to guess. But if you own these 10-year treasuries, you could be off 10 or 15%. If you own mortgage-backed securities, it could be off a little bit more. If you own short-term securities, they're off a little bit less.
But these are with the government.
You get a loan collateralized by these assets. So you're still holding them, right?
Yes, and they mature.
So if the Fed takes an emergency posture and says, okay, guys, we want to avert a crisis in a year from now, and we're going to cut rates, these assets that these banks own will be worth more, which will allow them to repay the loan. As far as I can tell, all we've done is we've kicked the can down the road for a year. But I do think it's important for people to realize this doesn't solve the problem. It just means that mark your calendar for a year from now. We have a problem on March 15th, 2024, because all those folks that took money, what do we do?
What are your
suggestions? We need to have a real-time dashboard. We need to have a real-time dashboard at every single Fed that allows them, for every bank that they supervise, to know in real time. They can choose to ignore it. I'm not sure that should be true, but they are their supervisors. They should see it. They should choose to ignore it, but they should not have it.
The question of who you blame for this banking crisis has really become a political Rorschach test. And I've seen that there are 6 different parties that people want to blame in this situation. And there's some merit to all of them, but the degrees are very different. So number one, you've got the bank.
Let's go through them.
Okay, number one, the bank management of all these different banks. Clearly, very poor risk management, didn't do a good job. They are to blame. However, and Chamath is right about these banks, they differ in the details, but the point is that they're all operating under conditions of extreme stress. Where did that come from? Number 2, the Fed's rapid rate tightening cycle. Clearly, I think that the combination of poor risk management with the spike in interest rates, that basically has precipitated this larger problem. Number 3 is, I think, the Biden administration's spending, which in fairness, started with COVID before Biden, but Biden really intensified it. And then I think it really compounded the problem in the summer of 2021 by claiming that inflation was transitory when it wasn't. That allowed them to keep spending and keep printing money and kept QE going for another 6 months. That created the bubble of 2021. Everything got super frothy. And then that made the rate hike cycle even more vicious because you started 6 months later. They could have started 6 months earlier and it could have been more gradual. And I think that really was a disaster for the economy. Okay, number 4, the dereg in 2018. I think Elizabeth Warren and Ro Khanna have made what I would call a compelling case that the dereg in 2018 have contributed to this problem. I think in hindsight, creating a 2-tier system of banks where one tier are the systemically important banks who are completely guaranteed and backstopped by the federal government, and then a sort of lower tier, a second tier of regional banks was a poison chalice for the regional banking system. Because in the short term, it meant they were more lightly regulated, which may be appropriate for, smaller banks that aren't these mega banks. However, it has also now, I think, created a situation where people are less confident about them. And so the money flows are going from the regional banks to the systemically important banks, the SIBs. So like I said, it might be a double-edged sword. And I think we're going to have to look at those regulations and figure out what's the right regulatory regime to create confidence in the regional banking system. We want a thriving regional banking system. And so the question is, what's the right regulations that get us there? And then the final two that we can talk about later are, I'm hearing wokeness getting blamed, which, listen, I think that wokeness was a distraction. There were a lot of crazy programs happening at these banks. But listen, if wokeness was the key factor, the whole Fortune 500 would be out of business because they all do this stuff. They all do this stuff. So I think we're going back to the well a little too often on that critique. And I don't want to burn that critique out because I think that wokeness is bad, but it's not the key reason why this stuff happened. What I would say for sure is that if these banks had spent as much time on risk management as they did on ESG or on woke, then this crisis wouldn't have happened. So definitely a distraction, but not the thing that specifically caused it. And then just the final thing is VCs. And I just can't fathom at this point, given the multiple bank failures, given that we see the larger problem of unrealized losses on bank balance sheets, that somehow any class of depositors would be blamed for this. That just makes no sense to me.
I think the critique is specific to Silicon Valley Bank because I think, and this article was in the Wall Street Journal, but what it shows is a really complicated, intertwined relationship between VCs and Silicon Valley Bank, where VCs were given very cheap interest rate loans. They were given GP call lines of credit. They were given LP lines of credit. And then those same VCs would be directing their companies to put their deposits inside of SVB, who would then take those deposits and buy risk. Yeah. And while the reality is all of this stuff will come to light because I think it will get exposed as we go through congressional hearings on all of this. But I think pointing the finger at VCs in this specific case is somewhat warranted because there was a little bit of people working in lockstep together, and there was a lack of functional responsibility around how to be a true fiduciary. So if you come to a board and your founder is 22 years old and you give that person $15 or $20 million, I think it makes a fair amount of sense that you are supposed to be the more sophisticated financial person in that room.
Chamath points out the complicated relationship between VCs and Silicon Valley Bank. VCs were given benefits such as cheap loans, lines of credit, and other perks. And in return, they would direct their portfolio companies to deposit their money into the bank. This type of behavior is common in private markets, but it is not as strictly regulated as in public markets. Chamath suggests that more transparency and disclosure should exist around these relationships and potential conflicts of interest. He believes that poor risk management by banks, combined with extremely stressful conditions, played a significant role. He points out that the regulatory regime for regional banks needs to be revisited to create more confidence in the system. However, he dismisses the idea that depositors played a significant role in the crisis. What do you think about Chamath's take on the current banking crisis we're seeing and how this will affect the market in 2023? Comment down below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This is Library of Wealth. We'll see you in the next video.